Hello, I'm Patrick Ryan from the Tennessee World Affairs Council, and this is the Project Impact Japanese Investment in Tennessee from the Japan American Society of Tennessee, their public awareness initiative. Today we're talking with Keel Hunt. He's a columnist for the USA Today Tennessee Network. He has been a reporter, editor, Washington correspondent, and editorial writer. And from 1979 to 1986, he was special assistant to Tennessee Governor Lamar Alexander. He's also an author of several books of interest to this conversation, Crossing the Aisle. In 2018, he's got a couple of other books that should be of interest to you. Coup, the Day the Democrats Ousted Their Governor, and The Family Business, about the Ingram Book Company. He has another book coming out, and we will include details in the archive for this recording. You can find other recordings from this series, Impact Japanese Business Investment in Tennessee, at the Japan American Society of Tennessee YouTube channel, youtube.com, and just look for JAST. Keel, welcome, and thanks for taking time today.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's jump right into the conversation here. We're interested in your experiences and perspectives on the early foundations of Japanese investment, and that was largely the bringing of major manufacturing to Tennessee in the period where you worked with Governor Alexander as his special assistant in the early 1980s, 1979 to early 1980s. Can you give us a sense of what the atmosphere was like when Governor Alexander came to office and you were working with him? The 1970s had been, a time of lagging economic results for the country and for the state. And it was on the heels of the scandals related to Governor Blanton. So tell us, if you could, what the situation was when the administration came to office.
Well, I think the main condition that is relevant, Pat, is that as strange as it may be to think about now, where the Republicans are in such a supermajority position in Tennessee. In 1978, when Governor Alexander was elected, and when he, his certainly his first few years in office, there were basically no Republicans in the state capitol in Nashville. The partisan descriptions would have been just reversed compared to now. It's always been a conservative state, in kind of the classical meaning of that term, and there were a lot of the Democrat Party held the majority in the state legislature, both houses, and so the two speakers of the House and Senate were certainly Democrats, and strong Democrats, and all the constitutional offices, the Secretary of State, for example, and on around, to the extent that Alexander, was one of the very few Republicans in state government leadership, and that meant that he had to, and he was committed to doing this. He was very committed to working across the aisle, as we say, and collaborating with the Democratic majorities. Of course, the situation now is just reversed in terms of the numbers. I mean, Tennessee's congressional delegation now, 2 senators and 7 members of the House are overwhelmingly Republican, and of course, and the governor is Republican and so forth. Well, at this point, 1978, 79, it was just the opposite. So, we had a majority Democrat legislature, the congressional delegation, and so forth. And so that's one thing that I think is important to keep in mind about how things began to happen. And the other is, you alluded to the Blanton troubles. And so, of course, Alexander came into office actually 3 days early because the Democratic leadership on advice from the United States Attorney, Hal Hardin, a Democrat and appointed by President Jimmy Carter, sort of blew open what later became known in the media as the clemency for cash scandal. And they determined in the middle of January, during the week before the normal inauguration of the new Alexander administration, that there were more pardons coming that had been issued for the wrong reasons, and recommended that Alexander take office early. This had never happened ever before in any state in America, and so that had to be a scramble to make sure there were no bad folks being let loose. And I like to mention that because whenever we're talking about things like this, because that did condition to some extent the way in which the Alexander administration worked with the then still heavily Democratic General Assembly.
Yeah, we certainly want to get the background and context of what was happening in the state, and to that point, we know that there had been some Japanese investment in the state, Toshiba and Calsonic, but where did the main idea or thrust of bringing in Japanese manufacturing, especially in that era, draw from?
Well, you mean as the Alexander administration took office?
Right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, I regard as one of the early important things that, and remember, this was during the national administration of President Jimmy Carter. And Carter, of course, had been governor of Georgia, was a Southern governor. He knew these governors. He knew, among other Southern states in the first place, and Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, the Carolinas. And he had a conference, or actually a meeting that the president will normally have first of the year, and with governors, and the National Governors Association is part of pulling that together for the White House. And anyway, it was in that was one of the settings where Alexander heard President Carter sort of extol the benefits of looking for Asian investments in the South. He said governors look to Japan, that this was very fertile ground for stimulating economic development and growth and so forth in the international setting. And Governor Alexander, came back home, and he had a pretty good head of steam, having digested that information, and proceeded to try to understand it as best he could. Alexander was a very, I'm not sure he would accept this term, but he was a very activist governor. He of course knew the economic conditions of Tennessee. He'd grown up in East Tennessee. and that there was a need for good, better paying jobs. And he was hearing that a lot on his, generally and particularly on his campaign trail through 1978. And so the more he studied and worked with his staff and in cabinet, particularly in the Department of Economic and Community Development, said, well, yeah, Tennessee has had some success working with Japan. You mentioned Calsonic, you mentioned Toshiba. There were other, kind of smaller manufacturing companies that had come. Although the state administration previous emphasis had been on developing new markets for Tennessee agricultural products, and that was very important, still is. So he basically internalized this message from President Carter and took it to heart and proceeded to work on that.
And the concerns at all, if there were any, about Japan Inc., as it was referred to at the time, there was concern around the country that Japan was buying up everything. Was that something that the state government had to deal with in considering whether to make an approach to Japan, and also the notion of Tennessee becoming an automotive manufacturing location? That was sort of the transformation from what has become known as the Rust Belt manufacturing, moving out of some areas of the north and down into the southeast. So it gives us a sense of both the appeal of Japan as foreign direct investment coming into the state, and the transformation to an automotive manufacturing base in the state.
Well, that notion was still pretty new. And whenever there's an innovation of this nature, then there's going to be some pushback. There wasn't much pushback. I think people appreciated what had already been established in terms of agricultural trade, recognition that Tennessee was in the world and had to recognize that its competitors were no longer Nashville vis-a-vis Memphis, Knoxville, Chattanooga for new plants, but in fact the competition was in Japan and Western Europe and so forth, and so that was one sort of precondition or condition of the environment, and the more that took hold, the more that helped. There was also, and maybe we'll come back to this when you get a little if we get deeper into the Nissan story, but this was 1980, 81, 79, 80, and in the area where Nissan finally located the largest auto manufacturing plant in North America, was in an area of Tennessee, not far from Nashville, where there were still, veterans of the U.S. military by virtue of Seward Air Force Base having been in the Smyrna part of the state, and and there were still strong feelings about the war, World War II, and so maybe we'll come back to that. But there was that element, and it was. But what became more powerful for I think it's fair to say for Governor Alexander, and a lot of people in the economic development program, was that there needed to be more diversification of employment, of manufacturing, and that there were opportunities now to do that with a very high level focus from the new administration. I mentioned the speakers of the state legislature, Speaker Ned McWhorter, who followed Alexander as governor, by the way. Also, the Lieutenant Governor, John Wilder. In Tennessee, the Speaker of the State Senate carries the title of Lieutenant Governor. And so, these are very important and very able politicians. And they became influential and partners with Alexander, and not just on this subject, but on initiatives of education reform and so forth as well. So so the condition was one. It was certainly literally right for more diversification in manufacturing sector and the need for better paying jobs.
Yeah, you mentioned the Nissan experience, and I did want to get into a question about the what sort of groundwork had to be laid by the state administration, the governor's office, in communities around the state to understand the benefits of bringing in foreign direct investment in general, because often communities will see international companies coming in a bad light, and you certainly pointed out the lingering feelings, the sentiments from veterans of the war. But in general, were there any activities that had to be taken on to assuage the sentiments in communities about foreign direct investment in the larger sense?
Sure, and these things don't just happen. They have to be adopted as priority goals, and then a team deployed, in effective ways. I know you've spoken to a couple other people that you have interviewed on this program. One, John Gregory, who was a professional in the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development, with a particular focus for him on Asia and Japan and so forth. Very, very adroit professional in the department. And also, I know you've spoken with Randy Boyd, who is now president of the University of Tennessee system, and was a little bit later under Governor Bill Haslam, was the commissioner, the head of the Department of Economic and Community Development. And so, I mean, they could probably speak more knowledgeably than I, particularly John Gregory, about this early period and what was the environment into which what turned out to be the Nissan project pretty quickly evolved. And so I think frankly, the need for better paying jobs and to diversify the Tennessee manufacturing economy, I want to believe that sort of overwhelmed any narrow local personal interest. You certainly couldn't ignore all that because it involves strong emotions. And of course, in the at that point when Nissan was announced, and the groundbreaking in Smyrna and all that. By that time, there was also some resentment on the part of organized labor, not all of organized labor, but and not about bringing high-paying manufacturing jobs in, but it was more narrowly driven by by resentments for the building construction contractor, an outfit from South Carolina that was not a union shop. And so that became a flashpoint, and that led to an unfortunately ugly day around the groundbreaking. And so, I mean, that's another story, but I mean, all of that sort of conditioned the environment. It wasn't known that the company being prospected for it was Nissan until, a point. Nissan executives had been into Nashville, Middle Tennessee, other parts of the state, looking for suitable sites for, a heavy manufacturing operation. I mean, they had spent a lot of time working with Chamber of Commerce in Nashville at the behest of the Alexander administration, and as I say, visiting sites, but they maintained a very high level of secrecy in terms of what they were doing, who they were, and what outfit they were representing. But that's normal. That's something that
Sure.
happens typically.
Yeah, that's right. In terms of the long view, as you mentioned, Nissan was the largest. The plant that was built was the largest in North America for Nissan. So, what was the long view of where all this would lead in terms of Japanese foreign direct investment? You mentioned the objective was employment and prosperity, but what in the governor's office when the planning was in process, um, there had to be a 5, 10, 15, 20-year idea of where all this was going.
Well, yeah, there was such a long view. I would say it came about at the instigation of Governor Alexander and his Commissioner of Economic Development and pretty much all the other senior hands in this new administration. The fact that and there had and the fact that the ECD department and as well as appreciation in the governor's office for the need for discretion. We need, we needed to respect the prerogatives of a prospective employer, and all that got honored and respected. And there's some marvelous stories associated with that. But the long view, actually, it helped me to capture it and understand it even more deeply later. When I was doing my research and interviews and so forth for the book Crossing the Aisle, but by this time, in the 2010s, by this time, not only Nissan had come, but General Motors put what was, in the beginning, their Saturn plant in not too many miles away from where Nissan located in Smyrna. I mean, this is down in Columbia, Tennessee, Murray County. And I'm thinking in particular at the moment of my interview at that time with Commissioner Randy Boyd. And, he granted me an interview when he was now commissioner of ECD. And we talked about that long view and what had transpired for Tennessee and Tennesseans. And he told me what kind of this, you might call it the secondary effect, is the impact and significance of a major development like Nissan, and as I say, by that time General Motors coming, was that there was a proliferation of the of other companies that were, as they say, just-in-time suppliers to those manufacturing operations. So, in the first place, they gravitated to Nissan and then to General Motors and so forth. And, these were manufacturers of everything from headlights to taillights, brake assemblies, the other materials that a car manufacturer needs to put one together. And that becomes a very complicated, logistical operation, very important. And what Randy Boyd told me that day in his office was that, there were by that time already, I want to say the number at that point was 917 other employers of, in this just-in-time supplier category. And there's certainly by today over 1,000 such, but this is so important. I mean, they could have gone to Kentucky, northern Alabama. They could have gone a lot of places, but they came to Tennessee, and they pretty much came to all of Tennessee. I mean, there's a map somewhere that in the department that shows you where they located themselves. But that was very important. Secondary impact of winning these major manufacturing facilities, and that's continued to happen. I mean, just this year, major announcement over in West Tennessee by the Ford Motor Company on the production of their electric cars, and likewise, there's already this. There's been a subsequent announcement about that President Biden announced just the other day about, a manufacturer of the electric battery components in support of that development. I mean, so to me, thinking back particularly, 30 years from this vantage point is that this was a very sophisticated, far-sighted choice about who to pay your attention to in terms of economic development. I mean, there was still attention paid to, needs of farmers and other kinds of manufacturing, but this was so important. And in my book, I described the phone call where Marvin Runyon, the late Marvin Runyon, who was president by this point of Nissan North America, phoned Governor Alexander and said, Lamar, we're coming to Tennessee. And I still get chill bumps thinking about that scene. I mean, put yourself in the governor's chair and you're getting that kind of call after so much hard work and effort. But I call in my book that the phone call that changed everything. It was the phone call that changed everything. It changed the economic reality of Tennessee in important ways. Tennessee, a state that, had been poor, was at near the bottom of all the states in terms of family incomes. And of course, that takes a sustained effort, but this was a major shot in the arm, and it happened. And there were these wonderful stories about families that were able to remain in Tennessee, as opposed to their children and grandchildren moving away to get jobs. And so this was an interruption of that decades-old cycle. And I mean, listen to me. I still get kind of rhapsodic about what happened, but so have others, and it's just a terrific story. Now also interesting, and this may be on your list of questions to come, but what happened in Middle Tennessee in terms of the acceptance of a Japanese manufacturer, all of the many thousands of people who moved in either from excuse me. Many executives came from Japan, of course. Others came from Detroit, Cleveland, places, because Nissan, needed that kind of expertise from people who were already in the automotive industry. In addition to all of the local hiring that happened, and there's some wonderful stories about that. But you had so you not only had a need to assimilate more folks who hailed from Japan, but also from northern cities in the continental U.S. And the response of Tennesseans, particularly Middle Tennesseans, to facilitate that is just a marvelous story all by itself. And it didn't just happen. I mean, I think you had, so there was a concerted effort to help folks from both origins to, and of course that has affected in a good way our current culture. You had, along about, well, not too much later than these events, there was the chance in Nashville to draw in a team of the National Hockey League. And this was still, this was in the 95, 96 period. And at that point, there was still, a lot of people said, what in the world? I mean, people who grew up in Nashville and Columbia didn't grow up playing hockey. And so, we're a Southeastern Conference football part of the world. But so it turned out that the transplant of a lot of people from Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, into Middle Tennessee brought a goodly number of people, a whole bunch of folks, on top of the local hiring, but who had been lifelong hockey fans. And that helped to make successful the recruitment of National Hockey League to Nashville. Now that's not on your agenda for today, but that's a wonderful story. And that wasn't easy either. And so now, 20 years.
Well, I can tell you, Keel, as a big hockey fan, I remember the early days of the rivalry between the Predators and the Red Wings, and the proliferation of red jerseys in the arena. So, yeah, we can all appreciate the numbers of folks who came down to Tennessee for work and brought their hockey loyalties with them. That was a great recitation of a lot of things. And one of the things I want to unpack, you mentioned the phone call with Marvin Runyon and how transformational that was. But some of the common threads that run through our conversations are the relationships and how important the relationships have been with the Japanese companies. And can you give us just a sense of Governor Alexander's connections with the individuals who were key in Japanese business, maybe Japanese government, U.S. government, what his role was in building these connections that really beyond just the numbers on a spreadsheet are the things that make these deals possible.
Yeah, and that what you're probing here became a learning experience for Governor Alexander along the way, but also a way of enriching local culture in Tennessee. There was he had traveled to Japan many times, before there was a an announcement of Nissan coming. And he, I mean, he genuinely appreciated the cultural, not only differences, but similarities. And this, in fact, he wrote a book about this. You know, for example, it turned out that if you compare much of Japan, but in particular Tokyo with Nashville, I mean, maybe most folks don't sit around wondering about that, but there are these interesting correlations. They sit at about the same degree of latitude on our globe. The appreciation, you know, of course, much beauty in Tennessee, much beauty in Japan. You know, elevations similar, and this beautiful book that captures that, and so I think there was also, though, this is what led to, I mean, a lot contributed to this development, but you had in the fullness of time, the creation on the MTSU campus of the Japan Center. I may not be remembering that name correctly, but I remember a woman, a scholar named Esther Seaman, who's now gone, but was one of the early maybe faculty executive director for that program, which gave a sustained focus to the not assimilation, but the welcome to folks from Japan, and that was an important program. It wasn't very high profile at the time. It became higher profile naturally. There were I remember Ms. Lee Wallen worked with that program, as well as later in Governor Don Sundquist's administration. But there was this sustained focus on, you know, the difference, how important they were. And I think it helped create, you know, a lot of appreciation generally for different cultures. At one point, I don't remember the exact year, but there had been an exhibition at the Tennessee State Museum downtown Nashville of fine art from the Bridgestone collection. I mean, this is a major cultural event at the time in Nashville. And, you know, things like that began to help people know each other and know where you came from. And of course, immigration is always controversial at some level, but I mean, this was a particularly important event. And then of course, all the activity around making Nissan folks welcome, you know, was very, very important. And I think very successful.
Let's wrap up here with Keel. You've given us a lot to consider. You know, you talked about the corporate magnetism of proliferation of businesses that spawned from the automotive manufacturing, and you know, I've talked to some folks who also cite not just the supplying companies that came along with automotive manufacturing, but just the notion that a company like Nissan, Bridgestone, that they would establish their North American headquarters here, has been kind of a magnetic event for downtown Nashville. Bridgestone built a tower, and you know, you can't necessarily connect the dots to the development of downtown Nashville in the current era, but they certainly were an anchor in the current skyline. But let's just reflect on the success that has been the Japanese foreign direct investment in Tennessee. There's now over 200 Japanese-owned businesses that call Tennessee home. Would you say that Governor Alexander was the chief architect of the foundation of what has become this success story?
Oh, I would. Now, and I'm sure when you talk with him, he will point to other people, and I think fairly so. Um, the sort of there were a number of commissioners of economic development. To my knowledge, everyone, and under whichever succeeding administration aside, I would include in that statement, and everybody, um, has held true to that mission. Um, but at the end of the day, it was the new governor, Lamar Alexander, who sort of picked up on the idea from President Carter that this was a very wise thing to give attention to. And then he did, and then his administration kind of heaved in. And now there are other significant people. I mean, there was Commissioner James Cottom of the Department of Economic Development, John Gregory's employer at that early point. Later, Governor Don Sun, Governor Ned McWhorter, Don Sundquist, Governor Phil Bredesen, who had been the mayor of Nashville. This is in the early 2000s, and Governor Bill Haslam, embraced the importance of this development, and that's been necessary, and but in terms of the early, you're asking me a very direct question, in which I appreciate. And I think, yeah, you'd have to say, well, Alexander, there'd be a tip of the hat to Governor Blanton, who preceded him in terms of his economic program and the emphasis there on recognizing Japan, as well as other countries. I think of African nations who could become part of a growing program of finding international markets for Tennessee agricultural products. I mean, so that that was important. But the sort of promise of the Japanese and the Asian region as a long-term significant partner for the Tennessee effort, I mean, that was groundbreaking. It was significant. It has gone on for a long time, and eventually that did help to influence, the domestic automakers, namely, in the first place, General Motors, to come, because what they could do by coming to Tennessee was then compete on an equal footing, cost for cost, with the Japanese, who had become, problematic for, domestic automakers. And so they could show, speaking of General Motors, that they could build cars that competed. And we don't remember that much clearly at this point, that was an issue for them. And now they've been in Tennessee for 40 years. And but certainly I would say Governor Alexander, whatever else he might say, would be could fairly be called the architect of Tennessee's leap forward.
And lastly, the theme of our project here is to understand the impact of Japanese investment on Tennessee, and certainly you are among a handful who have been keen observers of the landscape in Tennessee for many years. So how would you characterize? We talked about job numbers and this or that arena with a name tagged onto it, but if you could just in a few words sum up what the impact has been for the state of Tennessee from Japanese direct investment.
Well, I would say, I mean, my mind is racing to think of all the adjectives. It was certainly groundbreaking. It was strategic. I mean, you're right to say it's not just the numbers, but it is reflected in the numbers. I mean, when Commissioner Randy Boyd, now the president of University of Tennessee, sat there and told me that these other companies, that there were now 917. I think I put my pen down on my notebook and I said, would you just say that again? And he said, there were 917, and now there are over 1,000. I mean, there's a list that you probably have, but they maintain it regularly. I mean, and those were not Japanese companies necessarily. There were several, but so you have 1,000 or so companies that were also domestic manufacturers who gravitated to Tennessee and Middle Tennessee and East and West Tennessee to become the a supplier of this component or that. I mean, auto manufacturing. One thing I learned to appreciate is just how darn complicated that is, and all of that. The notion of just-in-time manufacturing. Where you locate your facility, whether you're making hubcaps or taillights. You can't. You don't have the luxury of operating at your leisure. I mean, this has to be in the right spot, coming off the truck at the right time. And although that didn't originate in Tennessee, I mean, that was, probably Henry Ford gets a lot of credit for that. But in Tennessee, that got demonstrated as a highly complex organization of tasks, and it works. And that's, and people come to Middle Tennessee all the time to take tours and see this stuff. And of course, what it did in the long term was to establish Tennessee as the third, sort of the third manufacturing center. And I've seen some numbers that where you could base the statement it is the most productive in terms of productivity, in terms of speed to market or whatever. But I mean, this has been ground shaping for Tennessee and the South.
Can you talk just briefly about the impact on the people of Tennessee, the communities where prosperity has taken hold as a result? What the employment has meant, especially as you move. You talked about the map of Tennessee and how the businesses have spread around the state. There are areas, rural areas that didn't have Densos or Toyota and Jackson. What from your experiences in talking to Tennesseans has this meant to not necessarily the manufacturing motif, but the people of Tennessee?
Well, from where I sit, it's had a lot to do with pride, of being a Tennessean, that we are not just kind of old agricultural based trades, though those are all still important, but we're now part of the world. I mean, we've seen demonstrated for us the fact that Nashville and Middle Tennessee and Memphis and Jackson and Maryville and so forth are part of a world economy. I would kind of compare it to what happened with in 1982 when Knoxville hosted the World's Fair, and it was an international energy exhibition. Knoxville being a neighbor to Oak Ridge, where so much important has happened there in terms of energy innovations over the decades. And I think all of this has helped. It certainly helped the universities, and in terms of attracting faculty and programs. But I think more generally, Pat, it's there's a direct connection to the sense of pride Now, all that's going to be, distracted from on any given day by whatever is in the national news, but and particularly true now. But I think if you live in Tennessee, you're part of something bigger, and I think that is a profound kind of effect on a person, on a high school student, on kids in the family, that there's just a world of possibilities that maybe my parents, certainly their parents, didn't have the advantage of.
Well, that's terrific.
I appreciate this. Let me just say, I appreciate the program you're working on here, because I think that is that's so valuable to know that and keep that in mind. And whenever there's a new, as new generations come on, there's always the possibility that story becomes less clear. Not just who was the architect of, but that how is our place, our part of the world, how did it come to be, and what does it involve? And I think these are very important. What the program you're explaining does is right on the money of that subject. And so I thank you for what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing your insights and experiences. This has been a valuable contribution to the project on the impact of Japanese business in Tennessee. We've been talking with Keel Hunt. Keel is a columnist, author, reporter, blogger, photographer, resident of Sanibel Island, Florida, in the chillier months in Tennessee. And Keel, we thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
I'll mention that people can check out keelhunt.com to find out more about his blog Field Notes, and also to see which of his three books and another one coming out that you'll buy first. We thank you again, Keel. This has been the Japan American Society of Tennessee project on impact Japanese business investment in Tennessee. I'm Patrick Ryan from the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Thank you, and take a look at the rest of the programs on youtube.com and search for the Japan American Society of Tennessee. Thanks again. Everybody have a great day.